It is a cold day, a little bit windy too, I apologize. We're at Glendale Cemetery again. Probably our favorite cemetery. It's so big and kind of monumental. On our way to visit the graves of two sisters, Eliza and Ellen, who are Titanic survivors. By the way, thanks for tuning in to part 2 of our Life After the Sinking of the Titanic series. Whew. She's this way. Elizabeth Hocking is buried here, and her sister is buried in the next section over. So, two sisters who grew up together and survived the Titanic are buried in Akron, Ohio, less than 100 yards apart. Eliza, the oldest, and Ellen, the younger, were born in the late 1800s. And even though they survived the sinking of the Titanic and were able to settle here in Akron, both of their lives met a tragic ending. Eliza and Ellen were born in Tresco, in the Scilly Isles off Cornwall, England, to George and Anne Needs. George was a laborer, and Anne was a housewife. At the age of 17, Ellen was working as a domestic servant in the home of elderly unmarried sisters Anne and Marion Basusto in Cornwall. At age 24, Ellen married mason builder William Wilkes in Penzance, Cornwall, after the two already had a son the previous year. It's not clear what became of her husband. He disappeared from records around the 1901 census. Then in 1908, she married Adolphus Mitchell, although that marriage may not have been a happy one, as they soon would separate. On the 1911 census, 47-year-old Ellen appears as living with her married half-sister Joyce Ellis and her family in Cornwall. She had reverted to her original married name of Wilkes, and she was described as a general domestic servant. Searching for a better life, Ellen, her sister Eliza Hocking, Eliza's son George, two daughters Ellen and Emily, and Emily's two sons boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912 in Southampton. They were bound for Akron, Ohio, to the home of Ellen's nephew Sidney Hocking, who had emigrated to America the previous year. Ellen's older sister Eliza married confectioner's foreman William Hocking in 1880. The couple had 7 children, losing 2 in infancy. What became of the marriage between Eliza and her husband is not clear. What is known is William Hocking reportedly left for South Africa, never to return, and Eliza remarried in 1899 to engine driver William Guy. This was William Guy's 3rd marriage. Eliza became a widow in 1907 when William Guy died at age 59, and she would lose her 8-year-old daughter Dorothy, afflicted with epilepsy, just 1 year later. With her marriage to William Guy reportedly being an unhappy and possibly an abusive one, Eliza reverted to the name of Hocking upon her husband's death. She was listed on the 1911 census living at 6 St. Mary's Place, Penzance, where she ran a boarding house. Still living with Eliza were several of her children, including her married daughter Emily Richards and her family. Eliza's 2 sons, Sidney and George, had emigrated to America the previous year and worked at Diamond Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. Sidney and George saved enough money to bring the rest of the family to America, so George returned to Cornwall to fetch them. The family left Cornwall by train and had to change trains in Exeter when Eliza realized she had lost her handbag. Fortunately, George had the tickets in his pocket and some gold sovereigns. Originally intended to travel on the Oceanic, the United Kingdom's national coal miners' strike forced White Star Lines to combine travelers of the Oceanic onto the Titanic to conserve coal inventory. Little did anyone know that this would alter the lives of hundreds of people who were originally booked on the Oceanic.
I was thoroughly familiar with pretty well every type of ship afloat, but it took me 14 days before I could, with confidence, find my way from one part of that ship to another. Charles Lightoller, Titanic Second Officer.
The RMS Titanic was touted as unsinkable and was the largest ship afloat at the time she entered service, and the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners operated by the White Star Line. She was built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. The sheer size of Titanic and her sister ships posed a major engineering challenge for Harland and Wolff. No shipbuilder had ever before attempted to construct vessels of this size. The ships were constructed on Queen's Island in Belfast Harbor. Harland and Wolff had to demolish 3 existing slipways and build 2 new ones, the largest ever constructed up to that time, to accommodate 2 ships. Titanic was equipped with 3 main engines, 2 reciprocating 4-cylinder triple expansion steam engines, and 1 centrally placed low-pressure Parsons turbine, each driving a propeller. The 2 reciprocating engines had a combined output of 30,000 horsepower, with the output of the steam turbine at 16,000 horsepower. By combining reciprocating engines with a turbine, fuel usage could be reduced and motive power increased, while using the same amount of steam. The interiors of the Titanic were subdivided into 16 primary compartments, divided by 15 bulkheads that extended above the waterline. 11 vertically closing watertight doors could seal off the compartments in the event of an emergency. Standing high above the decks were 4 funnels, each painted buff with black tops. Only 3 were functional. The aftmost one was a dummy, installed for aesthetic purposes and kitchen ventilation. 2 masts, each 155 feet high, supported derricks for working cargo. Titanic's rudder was so large, at 78 feet 8 inches high and 15 feet 3 inches long, weighing over 100 tons, that it required steering engines to move it. 2 steam-powered steering engines were installed, though only one was used at any one time, with the other one kept in reserve. Titanic's radio telegraph equipment was leased to the White Star Line by the Marconi International Marine Communications Company, which also supplied 2 of its employees as operators. The service maintained a 24-hour schedule, primarily sending and receiving passenger telegrams, but also handling navigation messages, including weather reports and ice warnings. I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Edward J. Smith, Captain of the Titanic. Titanic's maiden voyage was intended to be the first of many transatlantic crossings between Southampton and New York. On April 14th, the Titanic was making great time as it crossed the North Atlantic. Seas were calm, and it was a moonless, clear sky. But destiny was lurking in front of them in the dark night. At 11:40 p.m. ship's time on April 14th, about 375 miles south of Newfoundland, the Titanic hit an iceberg. The collision caused the hull plates to buckle inwards along her starboard side and laid 5 of her 16 watertight compartments open to the sea. She had been designed to survive the flooding of up to 4 compartments. The Hocking, Wilkes, and Richards families were fast asleep, dreaming of a new life in Akron, when chaos erupted.
I'd put the children in bed and had gone to bed myself. We had been making good time all day. The ship was rushing through the sea at a tremendous rate, and the air on the dock was cold and crisp. I didn't hear the collision, for I was asleep, but my mother came and shook me. There is surely danger. Something has gone wrong. Emily Richards.
Asleep in another cabin, Nellie Hocking was abruptly awakened when she felt a bump as the ship struck the iceberg.
I jumped out of bed and asked the steward what was wrong. He said, "Oh, nothing much, child. Go back to bed." I was going back, but noticed several persons coming up the passageway with life belts on. So I dressed completely, and by that time, the steward told me to go up on deck. My brother George was one of the first to help fill the lifeboats. He told me to get in, and I didn't want to, but he insisted. Nellie Hocking.
Initially, Nellie thought it seemed fun to get into the boat and be lowered to the water. She expected to return to the Titanic to tell her mother about the experience. Meanwhile, her mother, sister, and nephews were ascending into chaos. They were ushered through a dining room to a ladder that led to the upper deck and whisked through portholes into a lifeboat that had a foot of icy water in the bottom.
Once the boat had started away, some of the women stood up, and the crewmen, with their hands full with the oars, simply put their feet on them and forced them back into the sitting position. Emily Richards.
Watching in the dark, Nellie said some women in her lifeboat were worried about their husbands. That's when she realized her brother George was in danger.
When we saw a row of lights go out on the Titanic, we were frightened. When we saw another row go out, we wanted to row back and get those we had left. Then came a crash, and the whole ship broke in half. All the lights went out, the broken parts went down, and we heard the screams of those left behind. Oh, I want to forget those screams. Nellie Hocking.
The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m., claiming more than 1,500 lives. With bodies floating all around, sailors in Eliza and Emily's lifeboat plucked 7 men out of the icy water. Overcome with hypothermia, they babbled incoherently and tried to overturn the boat. 2 died soon after. On Nellie's lifeboat, everyone was screaming, crying, sick, frozen, and wet until the rescue ship Carpathia reached them before dawn. Aboard the Carpathia, distraught families learned who was saved and who was lost. George Hocking was among the missing. In Akron, Sidney Hocking didn't know his family was on the Titanic until he read it in the newspaper. The clan was supposed to cross a week later aboard the Oceanic.
If brother is lost, I know it will kill mother. Just when I was looking forward to a happy reunion, this horrible thing had to happen. Sidney Hocking.
Sidney hurried to New York, where the Carpathia landed April 18th with more than 700 Titanic survivors. The Hocking, Wilkes, and Richards families had a bittersweet reunion before continuing on to Ohio. Eliza Hocking told reporters that she didn't want to talk about this terrible wreck, but with tears in her eyes, she mourned for her son George.
My boy came home from Akron last December with typhoid fever, and I nursed him back to strength. He did look so well, too, when we left Penzance. I only came over here for his sake. He was such a wee lad, only 22 years old, to be left without a mother in a strange land. I never want to go back to England. I couldn't forget him there, where he lived all his life and where his friends would drop in anytime. Here, in this new country, which I don't associate with him at all, it will be easier. But, oh, if I could only have kissed the lad goodbye. Not a word to the grave did he take with him from his mother. I was so sure we would see each other again. Dear, dear, what happy times we planned last Sunday on the Titanic, when we should all be together today in Akron. Eliza Hocking.
It was Eliza Hocking's final public statement on the Titanic's sinking. Over the next 2 years, she quietly blended into Akron with her children and grandchildren. Unfortunately, tragedy again befell the sisters' lives after the Titanic. Ellen spent the rest of her life in Akron, Ohio. She was joined by her son William and his family, with whom she lived with until William's death on May 31st, 1947. In Ellen's final years, she became a recluse and was discovered by neighbors in February of 1955, living in squalor at her home at 681 Amherst Street in Akron. She was without heat or running water in the middle of wintertime. Although her home had furniture, she had been sleeping sitting upright in a chair in her living room. Unopened mail, some years old, was in stacks surrounding her. She was suffering severely from frostbite. Partial amputation of her feet was later performed, and she remained under treatment until her death. Ellen Wilkes died on April 27, 1955, at Akron City Hospital at the age of 90, and was buried in Glendale Cemetery beside her son. Fate caught up with Eliza Hocking as she stepped off a curb in Akron. Exactly 2 years after surviving the sinking of the Titanic, she met her destiny. On April 14, 1914, she took a streetcar to visit her daughter Emily Richards at 225 Arch Street in Akron. She may have been preoccupied with thoughts of the Titanic anniversary, when she mistakenly exited at Franklin Street, 1 block away from Arch, and apparently walked around the back of the streetcar to cross East Market Street. Shortly thereafter, she was found lying in the street. She almost looked like she was asleep. She had an injury, a $50-sized hole in the back of her scalp. A streetcar conductor flagged down 2 pedestrians after seeing Eliza sprawled on East Market Street in front of Akron City Hospital. The men were surgeons, Dr. Charles E. Norris and Dr. Charles W. Milliken, who carried the woman into the hospital. She was unconscious and never regained sufficiently to talk before the end came early in the morning. Police initially thought she was a mugging victim. Later, they theorized that an automobile hit her and drove off. The case was never solved. The brown-haired grandmother was 54 years old when she drifted away at 6 a.m. April 15th, 2 years to the day that she lost her son on the Titanic. It was said that Eliza Hocking crossed the Atlantic, but she couldn't cross the street. Thanks for joining us on for part 2 of this 2-part series of the lives of the survivors of the Titanic. I hope you enjoyed it. I know this was not the happiest episode and not the greatest ending, but it is life. That is what happens. For Eliza and Ellen, their lives both ended in tragedy, unfortunately. But those 2 women survived a night that I'm sure they never forgot for the entirety of their lives. You got something you want to say, buddy?
Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell. And remember, subscribe!
Subscribe! Okay.
See you in New Year!
Happy New Year, everybody. Take care.
Take care!
Take care.